All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 84, Part 3. Emmy Lou Clare Wofford, 1926 and 1996. Emerging from the Shadows of Harris. If you're listening to this podcast on its release date, March 1st, 2026, then you can help the Peace Corps blow out 65 candles on its birthday cake today. The origins of the Peace Corps can be traced back to the transformative events of World War II. During the war, Americans served overseas not only as soldiers, but also in humanitarian and reconstruction roles. Programs like the American Friends Service Committee and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration sent volunteers abroad to offer aid, planting early seeds for service-based diplomacy. After the war, the Marshall Plan further showed the power of U.S. engagement in rebuilding societies devastated by conflict. This era inspired a generation of Americans with the idea that personal involvement could foster goodwill and peace. President Harry S. Truman launched the Point 4 program in 1949 to offer technical assistance to developing countries. Point 4 was the first global U.S. foreign aid program. This initiative set the stage for the later creation of the Peace Corps by demonstrating how sharing expertise could contribute to global stability and understanding. However, some people were uneasy about the idea of this program, worried that it might signal America's ambitions for colonial influence. December 1951. Representative John F. Kennedy, Democrat, Massachusetts, suggested to a group that, quote, young college graduates would find a full life in bringing technical advice and assistance to the underprivileged and backward Middle East. In that calling, these men would follow the constructive work done by the religious missionaries in these countries over the past 100 years. End quote. Throughout the 1950s, progressives and visionaries like Senator Hubert Humphrey advocated for a formal international volunteer program, believing it would benefit both developing nations and American volunteers. In August 1960, following the 1960 Democratic National Convention, but before the election, Progressive Union leader Walter Reuther visited Kennedy at the family compound in Hyannisport. Under Reuther's leadership, the United Auto Workers had earlier that summer put together a policy platform that included a Youth Peace Corps to be sent to developing nations. They discussed Kennedy's platform and staffing of a future administration, but historians now generally agree that it was there that Reuther got Kennedy to commit to creating the executive agency that would become the Peace Corps. Reuther's suspicious death in a 1970 plane crash raised hints of assassination, following as it did on the heels of the deaths of other progressives, President John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Senator Robert Kennedy. It was in the early hours of October 14, 1960, that now Senator John F. Kennedy arrived at Ann Arbor's Michigan Union to spend the night. Earlier in the evening, he had debated the Republican nominee, Richard Nixon. It was now 2 o'clock in the morning, and there were 10,000 students waiting for JFK. He had not planned to speak, but he's not going to disappoint 10,000 people. And he was tired. He was exhausted. But he issued a challenge to those assembled, and it would ripple forward for a very long time to come. He said, how many of you who are going to be doctors are willing to spend your days in Ghana? Technicians or engineers? How many of you are willing to work in the Foreign Service and spend your lives traveling around the world? Or your willingness to do that, not merely to serve 1 or 2 years in the service, but on your willingness to contribute part of your life to this country, I think will depend the answer whether a free society can compete. So I come here tonight to go to bed, but I also come here tonight to ask you to join in the effort. The reaction to Kennedy's speech was swift and electric. In the days that followed, 700 students signed up for a non-existent international humanitarian program. And it was on March 1st, 1961, that President Kennedy signed the executive order that formally established the program known as the Peace Corps. Since that time, more than 250,000 participants, and still growing. Two names associated with the Peace Corps from the beginning were Kennedy's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, and an enthusiastic 25-year-old Southerner with a head full of ideas who'd been raised in New York. His name was Harris Wofford, and he was a passionate advocate for civil rights and global engagement. In fact, in 1947, the 21-year-old Harris Wofford had first met the 30-year-old John F. Kennedy at a party at Clare Booth Luce's Connecticut home. And JFK remembered that encounter, and he brought Harris on board as a consultant. Now, Kennedy later admitted that he half expected the Peace Corps plan to fail. He hired his brother-in-law to lead it, since it would be easier to fire a relative than to fire an employee. But Harris Wofford was determined that this plan would not fail. Harris Wofford, 1926-2019. He was born in New York City to a line of Southern aristocrats. While attending high school in Scarsdale, New York, he formed the first chapter of the Student Federalists, and he became their first president. This became a national organization. He left high school after his junior year, and he served as a corporal and aviation trainee with the Army Air Force during the war. He wrote a book when he was 20 called It's Up to Us. He graduated from the University of Chicago in June 1948, just a few months after the Johnson City, Tennessee Press carried a wedding announcement in February that he was to marry Miss Emmy Lou Lindgren, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gustav L. Lindgren of South St. Paul, Minnesota. Is there a more Minnesota name than Gustav Lindgren? Emmy Lou was scheduled to graduate from the University of Minnesota in June. She had been elected to the first executive council of the United World Federalists, and that summer she studied at Oxford in England on a Minnesota research scholarship. She was a member of the Delta Gamma sorority, the Mortar Society, Honorary Women's Society, and she became president, the national president of the Student Federalist Movement in 1945-46. That was while she was speaking at a Student Federalist meeting in Eau Claire, Wisconsin in 1943 that she met her future husband, Harris Wofford. He was only 17 years old. He was a junior in high school, but he took a shine to this intense, brilliant woman, and he started courting her. But he started to call her Clare in honor of the city where they had met, Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Well, Emmy Lou kind of liked the name Clare, so eventually she took both the name Clare and the name Wofford for her own. After they graduated and married, Harris and Clare went to India for 8 months in 1949 to study the teachings of the recently assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, whose principles guided the Woffords throughout their lives. The book they wrote together, entitled India Afire, later served as further stimulus for the Peace Corps. In it, they made the startling declaration that, remember, this is 1949, quote, America's discrimination against the colored man is the chief obstacle to our communication to the rest of the world. An Asian, as Nehru demonstrated, identifies himself with any colored man. So when an American Secretary of State, such as Burns, attacks Stalin for denying free elections, the Asian only laughs sarcastically, for he's heard there is racial equality in Russia, but not in Burns, South Carolina. Whenever we spoke of progress being made in colored-white relations, an Indian would want to know how many Americans were in jail over the question. After Gandhi, jail going is the sign of seriousness. In the book, the Woffords took different tactics. Harris served as Gandhi's apologist, his admirer. Clare critiqued India's economy. When they got back from India, Harris enrolled at Howard Law School. That made him the first white student to do so since the suffragist movement of the early 1900s. But after a year at Howard, he transferred to Yale Law, and he received his law degree in June 1954. He started his public service career as a legal assistant for the Reverend Theodore M. Hesburgh on the United States Commission on Civil Rights, where he served from 1957 to 59 during the Eisenhower administration. While he was at Howard, Harris toured Alabama doing research on the status of civil rights in the South. It was during this trip he first encountered a young Baptist preacher named Martin Luther King Jr., who made a tremendous impression on him. Wofford wrote to King, and he sent him a copy of the book that he and Clare had written, India Afire. He offered his perspectives on the application of the techniques of Mohandas Gandhi to Montgomery, Alabama. King recalled reading a copy of a talk on the application of nonviolent tactics against segregation that Wofford gave at Hampton Institute in October 1955. And the Reverend King later stated, quote, "This talk and other talks were widely distributed in the South, helping to create better understanding of what we were doing in Montgomery," end quote. Although he was initially not part of the Reverend King's inner circle of advisors, Wofford urged King to go on his India trip and was instrumental in arranging funding for that trip from the Christopher Reynolds Foundation. Now, King had some familiarity with Gandhi's teachings, but it was Harris Wofford, along with Westchester's Bayard Rustin, who played a significant role in deepening King's understanding of nonviolent resistance and its practical application in the civil rights movement of the United States. In November 1957, Wofford and King both participated in a convocation at Howard University speaking on nonviolence and the law. Wofford told the gathering that, quote, "What Martin Luther King has given us is the unadulterated message of nonviolence which Gandhi wanted the Negroes finally to deliver to the world," end quote. And King used some of the ideas expressed in this speech in his chapter, Where Do We Go From Here?, in Stride Toward Freedom. King wrote in the preface to his book that he was grateful to Harris Wofford for, quote, "significant suggestions and real encouragement," end quote. Harris Wofford's political career began in 1960 when John Kennedy asked him to join his presidential campaign and work with Sergeant Shriver on, quote, "winning over the Negro vote," end quote. But Kennedy also remembered Wofford's work in India, and he wanted to take advantage of that experience at some point. After several years on Eisenhower's Civil Rights Commission, Harris joined the staff of presidential candidate John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1960. Eager to win the black vote, Wofford arranged a meeting between King and Kennedy on June 23, 1960. When King was imprisoned at an Atlanta demonstration before the election, it was Wofford and Shriver who persuaded Kennedy to call Coretta Scott King and offer her support. She faced the specter of her husband sentenced to hard labor in a Georgia prison for a minor traffic violation while she was in the late stages of pregnancy. This phone call prompted the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. to switch his endorsement from Richard Nixon to Kennedy. Following the call, Harris Wofford and other Kennedy aides assembled a pamphlet that referenced it. Printed on blue paper, it was known as the Blue Bomb, and about 2 million copies were circulated mostly through black churches in the South, below the radar of the news, totally below the radar of white culture, who had no idea what was going on, and this had enormous influence among black voters. Most historians agree that this gesture by Kennedy, simply calling Coretta Scott King and offering her support, may have sealed his election victory. Because black Americans heavily supported JFK over Nixon, Harris Wofford's suggestion might have cinched the 1960 presidential race for John F. Kennedy. Now, despite the Wofford's interest in joining the Peace Corps, Kennedy appointed Harris as a special assistant on civil rights in his new administration. Political realities soon forced Harris into uncomfortable situations with some old allies, particularly when the Kennedys asked him to inform King of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's suspicions that longtime King advisor Stanley Levison had communist affiliations. Harris later wrote that, quote, "What Kennedy liked best in my role, and I liked least, was my function as a buffer between him and the civil rights forces pressing for presidential action," end quote. The Peace Corps was formally authorized by Congress on September 22, 1961, and within 2 years, more than 7,300 volunteers were serving in 44 countries. The Peace Corps began recruiting in July 1962. Bob Hope recorded radio and television announcements hailing the programs. Its membership swelled to 15,000 in June of 1966. Clare Wofford played a significant yet often overlooked role. She had gone through the India experience with Harris. She was an insightful collaborator. She actively participated in the discussions and the planning that helped shape the nascent Peace Corps' concept. Her perspective, especially on issues of cross-cultural understanding and the empowerment of women, enriched both the philosophical foundation and the practical planning of the organization. An early volunteer shared memories of Clare and family. This would have been 1962. He says, "I remember once, just days after arriving in country, walking with a handful of other PCVs from the university dorms at Erat Kilo Square along Haile Selassie Avenue to the piazza, the center of Addis Ababa, and passing a 4-story apartment building on the narrow city street, a building that towered over the shanties that then filled the capital city. Looking up, I spotted in the window of a 3rd-floor apartment a white woman, an American woman. In her arms, she was holding a baby, and beside her, barely old enough or tall enough to peer out of the window, were 2 little kids, a boy and a girl. They were all waving to us, the only Ferenjak walking down the street." I had to check that Ferenjak. I think what he meant was, the way he wrote it was Faranjoch, but Ferenjach is an Alhambric word that means white people. Okay. That waving woman was Clare Wofford, and she and the kids, as we volunteers always call them, had come to Ethiopia with Harris just weeks before and were living temporarily in that apartment. This was an adventure for the Wofford family, as well as for the Peace Corps volunteers. They shared our lives, and we shared theirs. Their home in Addis Ababa was always open and welcoming to the 280-plus volunteers who had arrived that September of 1962. 1966, Harris Wofford left politics. He became president of the State University of New York at Old Westbury. In 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, he risked his career when he allowed himself to be arrested when he protested police brutality. And 2 years later, 1970, he succeeded Catherine McBride, All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 24, and became president of Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. He held that post until 1978, when he joined the law firm of Schneider, Harrison, Siegel, and Lewis, LLP. Now, while raising 3 children and dealing with her husband's peripatetic lifestyle, Clare served as an assistant to the president for the development at Bryn Mawr College, and then served as director for the Centennial Campaign at Bryn Mawr College, all while her husband was serving as the college's first male president. She also served as a director for the Catherine Gibbs School in Philadelphia. This is one of the earliest and most successful secretarial schools in the country. She served as director of international seminars at the University of Pennsylvania and arranged meetings for business executives where the programs involved the Japanese economy, the Chinese economy, and American business. And all the while, she was reaching out to students in internship programs in businesses. In 1970, she found out that her friend, television journalist Bill Moyers, had been commissioned by Harper's Magazine to travel the country and, quote, listen to the people. She urged him, quote, not to go out earnestly in search of America's problems, but rather in search of its humor, its ironies, its humanness. Since we are obviously at the frontier of every new and old problem suffered by mankind, we need to be reminded that we are no worse than the rest of the human race. How can the United States find some humility and from it the chance to offer decent leadership unless we can laugh a little and stop our endless self-flagellation? Moyer's resulting book, Listening to America, A Traveler Rediscovers His Country, was a bestseller. Clare Linford Wofford was as well a director of the Washington Council of the African American Institute and a political analyst with the U.S. Department of State and a national champion in original oratory and debate. She served as vice president of the Philadelphia Area Committee for UNICEF, on the board of directors of the World Affairs Council in Philadelphia, and a member of the board of trustees of Temple University in Philadelphia. Now, after he spent 7 years in private law practice in Philadelphia, Harris served as the chairman of the Pennsylvania Democratic Party from June to December 1986. March 1987, he was appointed by Pennsylvania Governor Bob Casey, Jr. as the state's Secretary of Labor and Industry. April 4th, 1991, Pennsylvania senior senator, U.S. Senator H. John Hines III, died when his small plane collided with a helicopter in Lower Merion. This left his seat in the U.S. Senate open. By law, the Pennsylvania governor was required to appoint a replacement until a special election could be held for the seat. After he considered several potential candidates, Governor Casey appointed Harris Wofford to the seat on May 8, 1991. Harris had previously considered running for the office, but never thought the opportunity was quite right. But Harris Wofford thus became the first Democrat to represent Pennsylvania in the Senate since Joe Clark left office in 1969. At varying periods, Clare served as a political analyst on the Middle East and South Asia for the U.S. Department of State, director of major gifts for Bryn Mawr's Centennial Campaign, 1982-85, and assistant to the president for the development at the American College in Bryn Mawr, 1983-88. Clare Wofford was praised by Penn's emeritus president, Martin Meyerson, especially for her work as director of the Wharton SAS International Business Seminars that drew leading executives from around the world to Penn in 1978-80. Ms. Wofford also chaired the advisory board to the vice provost for the University Life in 1982-84. Her crowning achievement was as managing director for the semi-quincentennial of the University of Pennsylvania, a year-long 1990 celebration that culminated in Peak Week. It involved hundreds of speakers from all over the world and events all over the city. It was years in preparation. Clare Wofford led the way. 12-hour days, countless meetings, innumerable faxes, email, what's that? From my own experience of putting together international medical meetings in the 21st century, I cannot begin to imagine the difficulties encountered in those days before instantaneous messaging and electronic transmissions. Thanksgiving Day, 1995, Clare Wofford entered the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania for the last time. She had long battled an autoimmune disease, and on January 5th, 1996, she succumbed to leukemia. Only hours before she died, the phone next to her bed rang. A familiar voice on the other end of the line belonged to a once young politician whom she had helped. Harris held the phone up to her ear. Later he said, "I don't know exactly what President Clinton said to her, but she absolutely came up. Her eyes opened, and she lifted her head." With Clare's death at age 70, she left behind Harris, a daughter, 2 sons, several grandchildren, and loving memories from 3 universities where she had served. Her memorial service was at the Great Hall of Bryn Mawr College, a building for which she had raised the funds. She was interred at Laurel Hill West as Harris began to mourn his life and best friend of more than 50 years, as he anticipated a late life alone. But at age 75, Harris Wofford met a 25-year-old interior designer named Matthew Charlton, and they gradually fell in love. In April 2016, at the age of 90, Wofford announced that he would marry Matthew Charlton, a man 50 years his junior and his companion since they had first met. And that month, he published an opinion piece in the New York Times entitled "Finding Love Again, This Time with a Man." Wofford and Charlton married later that year, and they lived together until Harris's death in 2019, but I could not find Harris's final resting place.